Okay. So last week, um, if if you can't hear anything at any time, you need to message me on WhatsApp, and then we can.
Hello. Please say they are not in yet.
Oh,
It's only one person else.
no, but didn't that one person go to the other lecture?
I went, sir.
So why are they not here?
They might be on their way coming, sir.
Because I told Engineer Anand to always close you before time so that we can.
Sir, the issue is today we had Indiana's class earlier. That was 10 to 12. So we went back home and then.
Oh, then I cannot wait. If you had the lecture earlier and you went back home. All right, let's start the lecture. Okay. So last week, so how many of you are in class now? Just one.
Yes, please.
Okay, let's go on. So last week we talked about market analysis. Then we also talked about segmentation of the space market, and we said real estate is not a homogeneous product. It is heterogeneous in nature. And because of that, we cannot say properties are the same. They can only be similar. And then we also mentioned that due to the heterogeneity of real estate and other things like the secrecy of transactions and the difficulty in getting data, market analysis is often not a straightforward thing. But we also mentioned that as a developer or any investor wanting to invest in real estate, it is very important that you understand the markets before you make a decision. And so there are some basic market analysis that anybody wanting to invest or develop real estate will have to do. We also mentioned that market analysis will not be the same everywhere. What you are going to be looking at or the variables of interest will depend on the kind of property you are looking at and what you are seeking to achieve. But then I also mentioned that there are some basic things that no matter the type of market research you are doing, you always have to look at. And we mentioned some of them. Today, we also talked about the problems that comes with market analysis. For instance, we said it is sometimes difficult to get data. Sometimes to the data you get maybe too old to be relevant for the decision that you want to make at that point in time. Now, I told you this week I'm going to introduce you to some basic market analysis. So I'm going to introduce you to some basic market analysis. And I did mention that we'll be looking at some of the variables and how we use them or why they are relevant in analyzing property markets. Now, there are so many variables of interest, but the major 5 variables that every market analysis may be interested in are the vacancy rate, and the other side of the vacancy rate is occupancy rate. So vacancy plus occupancy is always equal to 100%. So for instance, if I build a hostel and it is supplying 500 square feet of space, if let's say 250 square feet is let, that means there is 50% occupancy and there is 50% vacancy. So anytime you know one of these parameters, the difference between that and 100 is the other. So for instance, if I tell you that occupancy is 80% in a property, that automatically tells you that vacancy is 20%. If I tell you that occupancy is 90%, then vacancy is 10%. So anytime you know one, you can find the other by finding the difference between 100% and the percentage for that one. Another important market variable that may be of interest to anybody doing market analysis is the market rent. The market rent. The rent that is currently passing for newly signed leases in the market is the market rent. It's also a very important variable. And apart from the market rent, we may also be interested in the quantity of construction starts and the quantity of construction completions. The difference between these two is that construction starts talks about construction that is currently ongoing, those in the pipeline. We will see why it is important to analyze that. Then the quantity of new construction completions is simply referring to constructions that have been completed and are ready to let on the market. Another important variable is absorption of space. In fact, you can look at absorption as demand. Absorption of space. Why is it also important? We will look at that. So sometimes I can give you variables and you explain them and explain the reason why they are important in market analysis. So let's talk about vacancy. So vacancy is simply the percentage of space. Is simply the percentage of a stock of space that is currently not occupied. So when we say something is vacant, it means that we do not have occupants in it yet. So if I supply space and a certain proportion of it is not occupied, then we say that proportion is vacant. That proportion is vacant. Sorry. So vacancy, we can calculate it mathematically, and I just explained that earlier. If I know the total amount of space, and I know what quantity of that space is occupied, we can then calculate the vacancy out of it. So the amount of empty space left divided by the total space supply times 100 will give us the vacancy. So if I have 10 rooms and each of them is maybe all those 10 rooms supply about 50 square meters of space, and let's say one of them is not occupied, then we can say that 5 meters squared is not occupied. So we can say 10% is vacant. So at any point that you are given the total amount of space or the total stock of space, and you can actually do this for a single property, you can also do it for a market. For instance, in Bamau, we can take all the hostels in Bamao, find the area of each, add it, then we know the total space supply for hostel. Then we can find the number of empty hostel spaces there. Divide that by the total space supply for hostel and multiply by 100. That will give us the rate of vacancy. Now, when you are dealing with vacancy or when you are making analysis involving vacancy, you need to be very careful about subleases. I believe at this point you know what a lease is. A lease is an interest in property that is granted for a fixed period of time. So for instance, as you are in your hostel, it's been let to you, it's been leased out to you for 1 academic year. At the end of the academic year, it will go back to the owner. Now, the reason why it is important to look out for subleases when talking about vacancy is that if you don't look out for subleases, you can consider a space as vacant when it's actually not vacant. For instance, if I rent a space, if I've rented a space and I'm giving you a sublease means that I'm giving you a term shorter than mine. So let's say you rent a hostel and you give, maybe that's for 12 months. And you give 3 months to somebody to live in. So that after that, you will come and live in for the rest of the 9 months. You've given that person a sublease. But if you choose to give the remaining unexpired term to another person, that is not a sublease, that's an assignment. But subleases are things that we need to be very worried about. For instance, if I give you the space for some time and I'm going to come back and continue, at that point, if I'm doing my analysis and I consider it as vacant, it's not actually vacant. And that vacancy might only be for a very short time. If I'm doing analysis for a longer term, I should only consider properties that are being vacant for a longer duration. Now, when you have space that is leased but is not occupied, we still classify that as vacant. So if I rent a room and I'm not staying there, whenever somebody is doing analysis involving vacancy, that room is empty, so they have to consider it as a vacant room, which means it is on the, it can easily be leased out. In fact, in some markets, you cannot rent somebody's property and leave it vacant for a long time. The property owner has the right to claim his property. But when we are saying space that is unoccupied, we are not referring to space that the tenant has put his or her things there and is not living there in person. That space is not vacant. If I rent a room, I put my bed and my bag and stuff there and I travel for some months or even a year, you cannot classify that as vacant space because that space is being occupied by me because my things are there. So why is vacancy rate important? Vacancy rate helps us to appreciate the balance between demand and supply. If vacancy is 0, it simply means that demand and supply are equal. If there is a high vacancy, it helps you appreciate that maybe demand is less than supply or supply is more than demand. Either way, it's the same thing. So the idea of vacancy rate will help you know the relationship between demand and supply. Whenever demand is more than supply, then we have what we call shortage. And once there is shortage, it will push price up. We know in economics that I taught you in your first year, whenever demand is more than supply, it will lead to an increase in price. And that has a relationship with the law of demand as well. Then wherever supply is more than demand, we have what we call surplus in the market. And that will mean that all things being equal, prices will reduce. Now, when demand is more than supply and there is shortage, we call it landlord's market. Because there is shortage, landlords can then get the incentive to increase price because there are more tenants than the space supply. Then, when supply is more than demand, then we have what we call the landlords, the tenants market, because at that point there is surplus and tenants will have an upper hand because for landlords, half a loaf is better than none. So even when you are looking for a certain rent, the fact that there's a lot of vacancy in the market, it gives an upper hand to tenants to negotiate the rent down. Now, in every market, even when demand and supply are keeping up with each other, there will always be some small level of vacancy, what we call natural vacancy. And that natural vacancy might sometimes be as a result of some factors. For instance, the time that is needed by tenants to search for the right property, and also the cost involved in moving into a new property. So if it will take me 3 months to find the right property, within that time, there will be vacant properties until I make the decision to take up space. Then there are also some behaviors. For instance, when you come to school from the beginning of the term, you go and look at this hostel, go and look at that hostel, look around, and then you decide which one you want to take. So at that point, the rooms are staying vacant for that short time. Now, sometimes too, one of the reasons why we have some natural vacancy in the market is because landlords will often want to hold on to get a higher rent. So when you come and you see and you ask the landlord to reduce, you say, oh no, then you will go, hoping that somebody else will come and take it like that. Then after some time they don't get, they will call you. Sometimes too, we have overbuilding. People will just be building without, most people don't do. In fact, this actually happened in Bamao. In 2010, when we came in as a Chinese population, the demand was so high that even people were converting their wives' kitchens in Bamang into hostel space to let out. Then, at some point, before UB separated from UDS, UDS started moving some of the courses in business school and education to Tamale. So when UDS moved these courses to Tamale, that means that student admissions to those large classes were now going to Tamale. So between 2013, 2014, 2015, 2016, I think, 2017, 2018, 2019, thereabout. Even, in fact, our numbers were very low. Real estate and land management that combined, it was not even up to 36 students or so. I think we had like 14 students for the land management. And this is as a result of the decision to move some of those courses to Tamale. What then happened was huge vacancy in the hostel space market in Bamao, because a lot of the landlords just built without, considering some of these market factors. Now, where can we get data to analyze the rate of vacancy in the market? We can get it from public records. For instance, if you go to the markets that are very developed, any property that is let, there's a record of, there would have been a record of it at the assembly, but not in Ghana. Because once a lease is signed, there will be an indication of it that this property is let, and it goes into a certain repository. So for instance, if I want to find vacant properties in a market that has this kind of public records, I can just go there and it will tell me these are the properties in this area that are not currently occupied. And I can work that out against what has been supplied or the total stock in the market, and I'll know the vacancy rate. Now, sometimes too, you can get this from landlords, but that process of getting it from landlords is a very tedious one. When you have to go from property to property to see which ones are vacant, and you will now find the total supply of space in the, in fact, if you are doing this for one property, like a hostel, like Miller Hostel, you come in and you see the number of rooms that are empty, it is easier. But when you are doing it for a segment of the market, it's difficult to use this process. We can also get that data through market research. You can also get that through market research. Like I just explained, that you could go to Miller Hostel and do that for that hostel. But sometimes too, in developed market, like here in the UK, for instance, there are real estate firms that specialize in trading data, like Savills, CBRE, like Bro Ghana in Accra, for instance, should be able to have this data that you can just come and to tell you, okay, in East Legon, the vacancy rate is averaging 10%, or in this part of the market, the vacancy rate is around 5%. You can get that from firms that are into brokerage. You can get that from research firms. You can get that from consultants. And like I mentioned, there are firms that sell data. What they specialize is building a repository of data and selling it to analysts who want to use it. Now, data on vacancy rate is usually widely available. It's something that you can sometimes find very easily, especially in property markets that are well developed, where information is always publicly available. And the vacancy rate is a market variable that when you get very good data for it, it is very reliable in terms of your decision making. Why? If property is vacant, you can see it that nobody is living there. In fact, even if I go to the assembly or any firm and they tell me the amount of vacancy, I can verify, or they tell me that this hostel has this level of vacancy, I can go and verify it, because the hostel is not something that is being moved from one location to the other. I can go and verify it myself. Now, vacancy is more reliable than other equilibrium indicators. And when I talk about equilibrium, I mentioned that equilibrium is the point where demand and supply are equal. And I said how these variables behave, like vacancy rate behaves, will tell you the relationship between demand and supply. Because if vacancy is high, then I know that supply is more than demand. But if vacancy is low, or there's no vacancy at all, then I know that supply is more, demand is more than supply. So by looking at this vacancy rate alone, you can be able to read meaning into the behavior of other variables. Because if I know that vacancy is high, then I know that, okay, there will be surplus. So that means that there will be lower rents. You see, the way you can rely on one variable to make decisions about the others. So vacancy rate is a widely used variable by analysts in real estate, because it's something that is easy to get. Another variable we have is called market rent. Market rent, and I already defined what market rent is. Market rent is a rent on typically new leases that have been signed in the market. So if, let's say, last week somebody paid for a 3-bedroom house in Bamao and paid a certain amount of rent, we can use that as a market rent, because that's the most recent rent from a transaction that has been made. It is also an equilibrium variable. So any variable that allows us to be able to appreciate the relationship between demand and supply is an equilibrium variable. Market rent, the current market rent is also an equilibrium variable, because I told you that its behavior is as a result of how demand and supply are keeping up with each other. Because, for instance, I said if demand is more than supply, that means there will be shortage, and that means there's an incentive for landlords to increase rent or property sellers to increase price. But if the supply is more than the demand, then we know that there is surplus. So that means tenants have an upper hand or the edge to then bargain for reduction. So rents will be lower. Now, it is the most important market variable. When you are looking at demand and supply, at the end of the day, I always mention that the invisible hands of demand and supply will always interact to fix price. They also price, which is the same as rent in the rental market, is the output of the interaction between demand and supply. And mostly when we are analyzing demand and supply, our interest is actually in rent or market rent. Now, it is very tricky to quantify market rent. And I'll tell you why. It is very tricky to quantify market rent. And that is because sometimes we could have an asking rent and an effective rent. So if you are quantifying market rent and you go and use asking rent to make your decision, you could actually be making decision about rent that is not realistic. What is asking rent and what is effective rent? Let me show you an example, because that will help us. If we use numbers, we will appreciate it more. Now, for example, if you want to rent a space for, let's say, 5 years, you want to sign a lease for 5 years, and the rent per square foot is 10 cedi. But then there's an abatement of 1 year. Otherwise, what we call rent-free period of 1 year. What will you say is the effective rent? Now, let's look at this also. If, for instance, so I'll look at another example and then I'll explain, I'll provide the answers together because it's similar. For instance, if let's say you are paying 600 cedis for 3 years, what will you say is the rent per annum? So it's 2 ways to look at it. If you know the rent per annum, you can find the rent. If you know the rent per square foot per annum, you can find the actual rent for the entire space. But if you don't know that, and you know, let's say your hostel, you just know that you pay 1,000 cedis. We can actually divide the 1,000 cedis by the total amount of space in the hostel to get the rent per square foot per annum. Now, the asking rent, if I'm paying, let's say, 1,000 Ghana cedis a year, and I want to take a lease for, the landlord sometimes wants me to take a longer lease, maybe 5 years. That means for the 5 years, I would have been paying 5,000 cedis if it's 1,000 a year. But the landlord says, oh, I'm giving you 1 year rent free. What does that mean? I'll not pay the first year rent. So in actual sense, even though I'm supposed to pay 5,000 cedis for the 5-year period, I'm actually paying 4,000. So even though the asking rent on the market for those kind of properties is 5,000 for the 5 years, I'm actually paying 4,000 because of the rent-free period the landlord is giving me. So even though the asking rent would have been 5,000 for the 5-year period, the effective rent I'm actually paying is 4,000. For instance, if you rent your hostel, in Ghana, we are paying rent per annum. But here in the UK, for instance, we pay rent every month. So if the landlord decides that, okay, Oliver, you are just a student and you are just moving into this flat, you need to buy a few things, you need to furnish it as well, and then put it in a shape for you and your family to be able to live in. So to be a generous landlord, the first 3 months rent, I'm giving it to you for free. So even though the asking rent is, for instance, I pay £1,300 a month. So when you multiply that by 12, it gives you an idea of the rent I'm paying for the whole year. If my landlord decides to give me 3 months rent-free period, it means that I'm going to actually subtract 3,900 from the entire year rent. So what is left is actually the effective rent. The reason why it is important to note the difference between the asking rent and the effective rent when you are making analysis is that if your interest is to get a general idea of what is happening in the market, then you will be using the asking rent on the market to inform your decisions. But if the purpose of the analysis is for the landlord to actually know how much is getting per unit area, and he has given some rent-free period to the tenant, and you don't take that out, you will actually create the impression to the landlord that he's getting a certain amount when he's actually getting less than that. Now, we also have what we call the real rent and the rent, the nominal rent. Sometimes it's not like you are having a rent-free period or whatever, but especially in an environment where there is inflation, you know, when you rent out property and tenants pay, there are some operation expenses that you have to take out. And this is to meet the cost of certain services that keep the property running. Now, inflation affects the value of money. So whenever I get my rent, to get the real rent, I need to make an adjustment for inflation. So for instance, if we represent the general level of inflation in Bamahu by F, then we can calculate the real rent as the nominal rent divided by 1 plus inflation. And it's also important to have to consider the general impact of inflation when you are examining the trend in the real rent. Because other than that, you could assume that you'll be getting a certain amount of rent. So even though you get that money, in terms of value, it is actually less than that. In fact, you might have done time value of money in level 100. So when you take a look at all of this, you look at the level of inflation and make adjustment for it. What that means is that all these mathematics that we have to do will make the quantification of market rent difficult and sometimes also less reliable. Why? Because if I pick, for instance, a wrong inflation figure and I'll be giving an idea of a real rent to my client, which is not actually the case. Now, the rent levels will often be quoted in averages. If you go to the market, you cannot just get an actual real rent. The rent will actually be quoted in averages. For instance, if I take the rent from Miller Hostel, Palms Hostel, like the major hostels in Bamahu, and I add all that rent, and I find the average of it, that will be the average rent. So I can use that to make a decision in the market and say, averagely, in Bamahu, a hostel space is going for maybe 15 cedis per square foot. By a natural sense, that is not what may be like representative for other properties. Now, sometimes you will not look at the average. In fact, sometimes you have to use other things. So here we are talking about measures of central tendency here. Mode, median, and the mean. The mean is the average, which we know. But sometimes you have to use the median. The median is actually used when there is an equal distribution of the rents. Then you pick the middle rent. When you have arranged them in an orderly manner, in ascending order. Now, we can also pick the modal rent. For instance, if there are 10 hostels, and let's say about 8 of them, the rent is going for 15 cedi per square foot. That means that the rent that is occurring most is that one. So I can use that if I'm looking to do analysis involving a new property that I want to develop in that same area. Now, current market rent is not something we can get from historical data, because it has to be current. It has to be current. So if you take the rent that we paid about 14 years ago as students in Bamao, and you want to use that to decide on rents today in Bamao, that would have been a big mistake. So we cannot determine it from historical data, but it has to be current data, which we can still get from the same sources that I talked about. So if I'm an estate agent, and just last month, I helped a landlord to rent out some 3 properties in Bamao. If somebody else is looking to rent those properties out, they can fall on me to give them an indication of the recent rent that I got. And again, there are brokerage firms, there are valuation firms, there are data firms that will sell this data. We can also get it from the National Statistical Service. This is one of the reasons why anytime they do these, their surveys, the living standard survey that National Statistical Service in Ghana has been doing. Sometimes I'm wondering why they don't integrate much information on rent into it, because it's a very major household expenditure. So when you're talking about income and expenditure, that should have also come in. So normally in the developed world, the statistical services should be having some of these data. In fact, in an area or in jurisdictions where rent control is working properly, in actual sense, data about transactions in the area, a landlord is supposed to share a copy of it with the rent control office, so that that property comes off the data of vacant properties. And then they also have an idea the rent it was let for. But here in Ghana, nobody will do that, and nobody will also question them. Now, another variable is construction. And construction, we can talk about 2 aspects of it: construction start and construction completion. Now, let me just mention that all the variables we are talking about, I mentioned in like 2 weeks ago, or is it last week? Yeah, last week. Every variable that we are looking at in the market is either a demand side variable or a supply side variable. So the market rent and the occupancy and vacancy that we talked about are demand side variables. No, they are equilibrium variables, because they help us understand the relationship between demand and supply. Some variables like construction start and construction completion are supply side variables. They are supply side variables. So the construction starts, we are talking about pipeline construction. And when we talk about pipeline construction, it's not only buildings that are under construction and have not been completed. In fact, those are on the drawing table as well. So you have to even go to the assembly to get data on the ones they have recently given permit. those on the table that are being considered for permitting applications. Those that, even if you can get the chance to get information about what other developers are planning, you need to add that into your pipeline construction. The reason why pipeline construction or construction start is very important is that it is able to let you know what stock of supply will be there by the time you complete your project. So if I'm building a hostel and there are others who are also building and they have already started and they are ahead of me, if I don't consider their hostel that they are building, by the time I finish mine, they have already finished and let out, and their mine will now be vacant. So if I know that, okay, there is a shortage of about 10,000 square feet of space in the market for hostel in Bamao, but currently construction that is going on, by the time it completes, it can supply about 8,000. That tells me that I should not be supplying more than 2,000 if I don't want my space to be vacant. Of course, there are some exemptions to it anyway. Now, this is the reason why it is important to quantify the quantity of construction or space that is in the pipeline to be supplied is because construction itself as a process can take time. And then typically will normally be in the form of few months to about, even sometimes it can even be a year or number of years. So if I'm looking to come and develop a property, and I know that the pipeline construction already is supplying some amount of space, I know exactly what to also add in order to get the best rent. Or if there's some construction going on and I know that this will complete in 6 years' time or 3 years' time, but I know that mine is going to be complete in a year, then it gives me an idea of what to do with development to make sure that I supply very early to get the best tenants. So in any kind of market analysis, when you are looking at the supply side, it must include the total amount of space in projects that are even on the table of the planning authority to get permits. If you ignore them, what that means is by the time you also go and get permit, they have gotten theirs and they are building. And then you will now realize that by the time you finish, there are no tenants for you anymore. So you need to understand the market. You just don't need to know how much you supply. You also need to know when to supply and what to supply. So construction starts. Let me illustrate it using a timeline. Take a look at this. Let's look at from January to December. From January to December. Now, the total supply, for instance, and I'm using UBITS as an example. For instance, let's assume that the demand for student hostel in Bamao is expected to increase by 8,000 square feet in January 2025, this year. The question will be, how much should you add as a developer? Now, you have been told pipeline projects are 7,500. Pipeline projects are 7,500. The supply is expected to, the demand is expected to increase by 8,000. That means that any rational developer coming to develop on the market should not add more than 500 square feet because there's already 7,500 under development, which will come onto the market soon. This is why an understanding of construction starts is very important to developers. Then we also have construction completions. Construction completion simply refers to the quantity of space that is ready to let or is ready to be leased out. I mentioned to you at the beginning of this course that the development process will always end with occupancy. In fact, the development process has been completed when the property has been occupied by tenants. And this is one of the reasons. So when you build, you cannot just say you have supplied space. We can only consider your newly built as space that has been supplied when it is ready on the market. In fact, you put to let or vacant property available that tenants can come and let. So when you build and it's standing there and you still have some things to do to fix locks and all those things, it has not come as part of the supply stock yet. So construction completions simply refer to the additions to the supply side of the market. And that one too, you need to know the difference between net addition and gross addition. The reason is, even though you are adding new supply, there may also be some of the space that is going out. For instance, there could be conversions and demolitions. So if we used to have 10 houses at a place, and that's all the space supply for residential property in the market, and you come and build and add 2, you have added 2, but you cannot simply say the total supply is 12 houses now. You need to check that somebody has not demolished a house or somebody has not converted a house into office building, because any conversion or demolition is a subtraction from the total stock. It's a subtraction from the total stock. So look at the difference between construction starts and construction completion. For instance, the figure below shows the importance of construction start in analyzing space market. Now, the same example that I gave you, the total stock or supply is 12,000 square feet. Now look between July and August. There's a new supply of 6,000 square feet, which is waiting to be let. That new space is ready to be let. So it is going to be counted as part of the supply stock. So if I want to start the development of a project, let's say I want to start my project at a certain stage to make sure that when I finish, I'll get tenants. Remember, in this example, we are saying that demand will increase by 8,000 square feet. I shouldn't just get up and go and be developing 8,000 square feet, because I've been told that there's a new supply of 6,000 square feet waiting to be let. That means it's going to come out. So it means that it's coming out of this 8,000, which means any development I'm going to do, maximum should be 2,000 square feet left for me to finish the requirements in the market. Now, any rational developer will wait to probably start the development after maybe somewhere in August. Why? Because students often come to school, let's say, no, sorry, any rational developer will work hard to make sure that the project is completed by August. That's why I put the red line. Why? Because the academic year often starts in September. So latest by August, your space should be completed and should be ready to go on the market. So if there is any completed construction like the 6,000 square feet we are seeing here, that is stock that is waiting to come onto the market. I cannot write it off at all in my analysis. If I don't consider that, I could assume that the whole of the 8,000 is needed. I'll start building an 8,000 square feet hostel. Meanwhile, before I realize 6,000 is already given by the other landlord who already has space waiting. Because for students, they are reopening school, they need a place to stay. They won't wait for me. Now let's look at the difference between net supply and gross supply. I already mentioned that. We have talked about demolitions and conversions. In any market, especially older markets, where there are old houses and people are now like certain portions of Accra and Kumasi. In fact, the bare land alone is even of value than the property standing on it. So there are often demolitions and conversions of old structures into something else. You need to consider it. If you don't consider it, for instance, if we demolish a house and used to build a filling station, we have reduced the space supply for residential, but we have also increased the stock for filling station. That's what that means. So conversion of old structures as well as the construction of new space is something that you actually need to work the difference between. So if any space is going out of the market and you don't consider it, you will actually make a wrong assumption of the amount of supply in the market. So let's say along the road in Bamao, they've demolished 2 houses and converted that into. Perfect. Let me give you an example. You see this Fanco Hospitality Hotel in Bamao. It used to be a student hostel. When we were students, they were building it. I think they started letting it out somewhere in 2013, 2014 or so. Now, when the example I gave you earlier on, when landlords did not analyze the market well and they overbuilt because UDS has moved courses to Tamale and there was surplus. That hostel, now students were now getting access to better hostels in terms of closeness to the roadside and to campus. So that hostel was becoming vacant and they converted it into a hotel. So if it used to be part of the hostel stock and you are still making analysis and you don't subtract that out, you will still count it as part of supply. In fact, when you are also doing for hotels, you be still tempted to count that. So it means that you have duplicated that space, and that means you are reporting on wrong parameters for your clients. So when there's a demolition, it means a certain type of space is losing its quantity, then another is gaining. So if I demolish a house and I build a hostel, typical residential have lost, but then for hostel space, there's an increase. So this is just a matter of addition and subtraction. Another important variable is what we call absorption. Absorption is simply the rate at which property is taken up or space is taken up or occupied. Now, we are looking at the amount of additional space that is occupied every year. So we already have students in hostels. Let's assume that they are going to stay in those hostels throughout their studies for the 3 years. The following year, there's a new supply of space. Then it comes to add to the space for hostel market. What proportion of it is occupied is what we call the absorption. And it's a demand side variable. So you see, we've looked at equilibrium variables, we've looked at supply side variables, then we are looking at demand side variable. And absorption can be differentiated into gross absorption and net absorption. And again, it has a very similar relationship to the one we just looked at for the construction starts and completions, where we are talking about demolitions and conversions. So what is gross absorption? Is the total amount of space for which new leases were signed during the year, regardless of where the tenants are coming from. So if we are analyzing gross absorption, we are simply looking at new leases that have been signed. So let's say when school reopened in September, the amount of leases that students have signed with landlords, if it is 1,000 leases, we just say, okay, 1,000 leases have been signed. Gross absorption is actually used to appreciate the frequency of transaction. Is there one space rented almost every day? So the frequency of transaction can be looked at. Then, why do we normally use that? It is not just a good measure of transactional activity because it allows you to know how frequent deals are entered into in terms of renting. But it is not a very good measure of the real behavior of absorption or the real growth in the demand for space. If you want to measure the real growth in demand and you are using net absorption, like if you are using gross absorption, it could be misleading. And I'll show you why. Because we said gross absorption is simply interested in the number of newly signed leases. So if I simply move from one place in the market to go and sign a lease somewhere else, it is me, that same tenant, who have moved from one location to the other in the same market. You may double count me. You will double count me as a new tenant. Meanwhile, I have left one space and I've come here. And that brings us into net absorption. So net absorption, unlike gross absorption, will actually reflect the net change in the amount of occupied space in the market. So if, for instance, there are 100 newly signed leases in the space market in Bamao, and gross absorption will just say, okay, we've had newly signed 100 newly signed leases. Gross absorption will go beyond that to see where the tenant, are they all new students who are just coming? Or some of them used to live at Blue Hill and they have just moved to towards the Bamao, the filling station, total filling station area. In that case, they are not new tenants. So if you are adding the new space they are occupying, you need to go and subtract the old space they have left so that you don't double count them. That will let us appreciate the real growth of demand. In fact, it gives you a very true picture of demand in the market. It gives you the true picture of demand. And it usually indicates, you know, the reason why investors and people are interested in net absorption is that it helps you know the exact amount of space you need to supply. The exact amount of space you need to supply onto the market. It is a better measure of demand growth. It's a better measure of demand growth because I've just told you why. It helps you avoid that error of duplication of transactions. Now, we know we saw net construction completed. We also saw the gross construction, and now we are looking at net absorption. When you compare these two, it will help you know whether demand and supply are growing at the same rate or one is growing faster than the other. Because if your net construction is higher than net absorption, it means that supply is more than demand, and that will mean surplus, and that surplus will then mean rent will fall. If net absorption is higher than net construction, it means that there is more demand than what is being supplied. So the net absorption will let us appreciate the relationship between the quantity of vacant space at the end of a period and the quantity of the net construction completions and what is expected to be added. Now we can actually mathematically calculate for net absorption. If we know the amount of vacant space last year, so time t minus 1 means the previous period. If I know the amount of vacant space that was left last year at the end of the year, maybe it was left with some 500 square feet of space. But as we entered the new year, there've also been some new construction. So that new construction is coming to add to the vacant space left last year. Then the new construction that has also been developed this year, not all of it is occupied. So there's vacant space left last year. Then we built new space this year. This new space we built this year also, not all of it is occupied. Some percentage of it is left. We need to subtract that from. So it's just like me, as of last year, I was having, let's say, by the end of the year, I was having 10 rooms left in a property to let. Then at the beginning of the year, somebody else built 20 rooms. Now, out of the 20 rooms, maybe 5 of the new 20 rooms have also not been occupied. We need to subtract that current vacancy also. And that will give us the net absorption. That will let us know how much has actually been taken up. So the vacant space that is left at the end of the year, at the end of last year, plus the new space we have built this year, minus the vacant space this year, will help us appreciate the net absorption. And I told you that, like for the real estate students, they would have been doing a lot of calculations with this. But in your case, it's not, you don't need the calculation. What you need is to understand the concepts and why we analyze them. So when you do this analysis, or whenever you make a calculation using this formula for net absorption, and the net absorption is greater than the net construction, which you already know, that means that there's a reduction in vacancy in the market. And I told you, when vacancy reduces, it means there's a tendency for rents to also increase. But on the other hand, when the net construction is greater than the absorption, it means that you are supplying more than it is needed, or it is being occupied. So that will mean that there will be more vacancy as well. And that more vacancy would then mean that there will be fall in the prices or rent. Another important variable is what we call the month supply. Month supply is usually, and this is very important for you as construction experts, because you'll be dealing with Gantt charts in any construction activity that you are undertaking, and you'll be expected to know when one activity starts, when it ends, when the other starts. So all of that you are doing is in a bid to give an idea as to when the entire construction project will be completed. So the month supply is an indicator of how long it will take in months for all vacant space in the market to be absorbed. We talked about absorption, gross absorption, and then net absorption. But the question is, how long will it take for me to get zero vacancy? In fact, how long will it take for students to occupy all the hostels? That is what we call the month supply. And the month supply works on the assumption that the rate of new demand growth will continue as indicated by the net absorption rate. What that means is that we need to make the assumption that the demand growth rate that we currently or we are seeing will continue to be like that. And it also works on the premise that there's no new construction other than what is already started. So in other words, the net absorption, like demand supply assumes that the growth rate in demand, so if it is 10% growth in student numbers every year that we've been experiencing in the past, it will continue. Now, the new construction that is already undergoing development, we expect that there will not be any new construction coming to add. So we are simply holding construction constant and seeing how long it will take for us to occupy that. All right. So there is no new construction. Yeah. So demand supply can also be calculated mathematically if you know the rate of vacancy, in the market, and then you also know the construction that is currently ongoing or the amount of space that is about to be supplied. We can divide that by the net absorption. Now, the net absorption, because we are looking at this in months, we need to divide the net absorption also by 12. So let me give you numbers. Let me see if I have numbers here to illustrate that. No, but I'll give you an example. Let's assume that we're having maybe 200 square feet of space vacant in the market at the end of last year. Now know that the vacancy at the end of a year is the same as the vacancy at the beginning of the following year. So if we had, let's say, 200 square feet of vacant space, and we also know that currently construction that is ongoing is maybe 300 square feet. That vacant space plus the amount of space that is under construction divided by the net absorption, and we know what the net absorption is. The net absorption, I told you, is the difference between what has actually been demanded in the market and also you factoring in things like how do you call it? Movement from one part of the market to another part of the market. And that was why I said that if I'm living in Miller Hostel and I was renting there and my tenancy has been captured as a transaction, if let's say I'm maybe one rich man's daughter, and after some 3 months, I feel like Miller Hostel is no longer good for me, I'm moving to go and rent another space. If you consider me as a new tenant, that means you are going to double count the lease I have also signed as another transaction when, in addition to the previous one, when in actual sense it's just one person, I've left here vacant and I've moved in here. And it's net absorption that actually let us factor this. And I said, because we are looking at this in months, we need to divide the net absorption by 12. So demand supply will be equal to the vacant space that used to exist plus the construction that is expected to be put on the market or is in the pipeline construction divided by the net absorption over 12. Now make sure you see in this formula, the entire denominator is the net absorption divided by 12. So you are not going to divide vacant space plus construction by net absorption and now divide all by 12. If you do that, you get a wrong answer. Now the vacancy in question is vacant space at the current period, not the vacant space in the previous period. So that's why it's not time t minus 1. The vacant space in the year we are talking about. And that can actually be the vacant space that was left at the end of the previous year. So when you work out and you get a month supply that is lower than the typical construction duration, then it means there's a tight market. In fact, if you work out, let's say it usually takes 6 months for construction to be completed, but you work out and you realize that the month supply is, let's say, 3 months, then it's a tight market. What that will mean is that even though it will take 6 months to complete construction, in fact, within 3 months, that space would have been completely rented out, which means the tenant will be waiting. Tenant will actually be waiting to pick up that space. And when that market situation exists, that is when you can see that construction is going on, but they are already letting the units before they complete them. Like I went to Peckham in London. There's a developer that has developed some flats in the middle of Peckham. And then whilst the construction was going on, they said they have already fully let, which means people have already deposited money in waiting to pick that up. So that is a tight market where it will be a very good incentive for you to develop more. But when the demand supply is bigger than the construction duration, then it is not a lucrative market for you to develop. It means even though it will cost you, let's say 6 months to develop, it will only take about 12 months before tenant will rent the space. So where can we get data to make analysis involving supply? Just as we saw for the other parameters, if we are looking at any of the supply variables we talked about, we can also get the data from local sources, regional sources, and then national providers. Now, we can also have new government and private projects could also give us an idea. Because if government is building some housing units somewhere, you get an idea of the total number of units that are being developed there. And you can just use that as an indicator to analyze supply and know how much to supply and how much not to supply. We can also get it from the municipal assemblies or the district assemblies. And also get it from them. In fact, if the works department is something that was very functional, this is where we should be getting some of this data. But unfortunately, in our market, it's not there. So it becomes very difficult to get. Can you turn the, let's turn the video on. And let's have an interaction. How many students are there now?
7.
7. Wow.